The one man with any objection to living under canvas was our senior military assistant, who preferred to sleep in his car. Unfortunately, he had to leave his long legs sticking out through the door, with the result that he could never get his wet boots off after a rainy night. We always used to pitch our little camp in a wood or a copse near the main axis of advance, if possible by a lake or stream, so that we could take a quick plunge before breakfast, or whenever we came back caked with dust and grime from a trip to the front. While the Chief of Staff naturally had to stay behind the command post to deal with the work and telephone calls, I spent the days, and often part of the nights, out on the road. I usually left early in the morning after receiving the dawn situation reports and issuing any orders that were necessary to visit divisions and forward troops. At noon I would return to the command post for a while and then go out to visit another division, for as often as not it is just around eventide that success beckons or a fresh impetus is needed. By the time we returned to our tented camp, which would meanwhile have been shifted to a new location, we were dead tired and as black as sweeps. On such occasions it was a special treat to find that, thanks to the forethought of Major Niemann, my second assistant, we were to have a roast chicken or even a bottle of wine from his own small stock instead of the usual evening fare of rye bread, smoked sausage and margarine. I am afraid that however far forward we were, chickens and geese were very hard to come by, having as a rule been snapped up by other fanciers before we appeared on the scene. When, with the onset of the early autumn rains, it became rather too chilly to sit in the tents, we found it both pleasant and refreshing to use the sauna baths, which, however primitive in form, were to be found on almost every farmstead. Such flexible leadership on my part was, of course, possible only because I was able to take a wireless vehicle along with me on these trips under our excellent signals officer Kohler, who later became a general staff major. Thanks to the admirable speed with which he could raise our tactical staff or any divisional headquarters on the air, I was kept continuously informed of the situation throughout the Corps sector, and decisions taken by me on the spot could be passed back with the minimum of delay. I might add that during my imprisonment after the war, Kohler proved a most unselfish friend and helper to my wife. Apart from my faithful drivers Nagel and Schumann and 2 outriders, my constant companion on these trips was my ADC, Lieutenant Specht. We called him Peppo because of his short, wiry figure and his youthful freshness and happy-go-lucky nature. He was a young cavalry officer of the best type, brisk, vigorous, somewhat irresponsible where danger was concerned, shrewd and quick on the uptake. He was always cheerful and slightly saucy. All these qualities had endeared him to me. He rode brilliantly. His father was a keen horse breeder, his mother a first-class horsewoman, and had won several big events as a newly commissioned officer just before the war. He was game for anything, and would have liked nothing better than to take his commanding general out on skirmishing patrols. As long as we belonged to a panzer corps and could be daily at the scene of action, Peppo was content with me and his lot, but when I became an army commander and could no longer be up at the front so often, he began to champ at the bit. It was a very proper attitude for a young officer, and I gave him his head on a number of occasions. In the Crimea, he twice led a reconnaissance squadron with great skill and dash. When we were in front of Leningrad, I again sent him to a division, but this time he crashed while on his way there in a Fieseler Storch. The loss was a heavy blow to me. Now let us return to 56 Panzer Corps. By 9th July, it had become clear that 4th Panzer Group's attempt to outflank the enemy forces, it believed to be at Pskov by sending our corps round to the east, had no hope of success on account of the marshiness of the ground and the strength of the enemy's resistance. There was nothing for it but to discontinue the manoeuvre and redirect Corps HQ and 8 Panzer Division onto the original northern axis towards Ostrov, as had already been done with 3 motorized infantry division. Still, since moving off from Dvinsk, the Corps had, according to intelligence reports available on 10th of July, smashed 4 or 5 of the enemy's infantry divisions, 1 armoured division and 1 motorized division, forces far superior to its own numerically. Apart from the thousands of prisoners we had taken, Our booty since crossing the Reich frontiers included 60 aircraft, 316 guns, including anti-tank and anti-aircraft, 205 tanks and 600 lorries. But the enemy, though pushed back to the east, was still not destroyed, as was very soon to become apparent. Now that the Panzer Group was concentrated around Ostrov, we at 56 Panzer Corps hoped for a rapid, direct and uniform advance on Leningrad, with ourselves passing through Luga and 41 Panzer Corps through Pskov. In our view, this offered the best chance not only of effecting the quick capture of the city, but also of cutting off the enemy forces retreating through Livonia into Estonia before our 18th Army. The task of safeguarding this operation on its open eastern flank would have had to devolve on 16th Army as it moved up behind 4th Panzer Group. Presumably acting on directives from the highest level, however, Panzer Group HQ decided otherwise. 41 Panzer Corps was allotted the main road through Luga along which to advance on Leningrad. 56 Panzer Corps, once again pulling out to the east, was to advance through Porkhov and Novgorod to Chudovo in order to break communications between Leningrad and Moscow at the earliest possible date. Important though the latter task was, these orders must once again have led to the two corps becoming widely dispersed, as a result of which each was liable to be deprived of the necessary striking power. The danger was increased by the fact that much of the country to be crossed this side of Leningrad was marshy or wooded and hardly suitable for large armoured formations. A particularly regrettable step was the removal from 56 Panzer Corps of the SS Death's Head Division, which had meanwhile been relieved in the Zebesh-Opochka area by 290 Infantry Division. The SS Division was now retained south of Ostrov as the Panzer Group Reserve. Thus, as had previously happened when we set off from the German frontier, the Panzer Group's main effort was again placed on its left wing. 41 Panzer Corps. 56 Panzer Corps was dispatched on its wide sweep round to Chudovo with only one armoured and one infantry division, thereby being denied the essential protection of its open south flank by the SS Division following along in echelon on the right. It was a particularly risky move when one considered that even though the enemy forces engaged by the Corps to date had been outfought, they were far from annihilated. Be that as it may, we were still convinced that the Corps would continue to find its safety in speed of movement. 3. Motorized Division, which only came back under command at Ostrov, had already taken Porkhov on 10th of July after a hard struggle, and was put on a minor road leading north. 8 Panzer Division was to drive through Zoltsi to seize the vital crossing point where the Mashaga ran into Lake Ilmen. In a series of battles, most of them fierce ones, the advance was kept going for the next few days. Except for one attack on the Corps command post on the north bank of the Shelon River in the early hours of 14th of July, apparently carried out by enemy reconnaissance forces, the enemy had so far not made his presence felt on our open flank in the south. That same day, at my insistence, 8 Panzer Division, which had taken Zoltsi after a battle against an enemy well equipped with artillery and armour, pushed on to the Mashaga sector. It found the bridge already blown. Meanwhile, Panzer Group HQ had transferred the main effort of its advance even further west of the Luga road. It had moved 41 Panzer Corps' 3 mechanised formations northwards to bar the way to the enemy forces retiring through Narva, north of Lake Peipus, before 18th Army. Only one infantry division of the Corps, the 269th, had been left on the road to Luga. Thus, 56 Panzer Corps suddenly found itself even more isolated than before in its wide swing towards Chudovo. Accordingly, we got on to Panzer Corps HQ, to point out that if we were to carry out the Chudovo assignment, our corps must have the immediate support both of the SS Death's Head Division and also of 16th Army's 1 Corps, which was relatively close behind. Before this appeal could be answered, however, 56 Panzer Corps was already in trouble. Early on 15th of July, we received a number of most unpleasant reports at the Corps command post on the Shelon, west of Zoltsi. The enemy had launched a powerful attack from the north into the flank of 8 Panzer Division, now strung out to the Mshaga, and simultaneously driven up from the south over the Shillon. This meant that the bulk of 8 Panzer Division's fighting troops, who were located between Zoltsi and the Mashaga, were cut off from the division's rear echelons, in whose area Corps HQ was located. But that was not all. The enemy had closed the trap behind ourselves too, by pushing up strong forces from the south to straddle our supply route. At the same time, 3 Motorized Division, advancing further northwards, found itself being attacked by superior enemy forces from the north and northeast at Mali Utagorsk. It was obviously the enemy's intention to encircle 56 Panzer Corps while it was isolated. The failure to echelon the SS Death's Head Division along our rear right flank had enabled him to attack across the Shillon with those of his forces which lay south of us. At the same time, the removal of 41 Panzer Corps from the Luga road had released the strong enemy forces there, and these were now attacking our northern flank. Our corps' position at that moment was hardly an enviable one, and we could not help wondering whether we had taken rather too great a risk this time. Had we been carried away by our previous successes to the extent of paying insufficient heed to the enemy on our southern flank? Yet what other chance should we have of carrying out our mission? As matters stood, the only course open to us was to pull 8 Panzer Division back through Zoltsi to escape the encirclement that now threatened. 3. Motorized Division had to be disengaged at the same time to give the Corps back its freedom of movement. The next few days proved critical, with the enemy straining every nerve to keep up his encirclement and throwing in, besides his rifle divisions, 2 armoured divisions enjoying strong artillery and air support. 8 Panzer Division nevertheless managed to break through Zoltsi to the west and regroup, despite having to be temporarily supplied from the air. Before completing its own disengagement, 3 Motorized Division had to beat off 17 successive attacks. In the meantime, after Panzer Group HQ had put the SS Death's Head Division under our command, it was possible for us to clear the Corps supply route. By 18th July, the crisis was as good as over, the Corps being by then firmly established around Dino on a front facing roughly east by northeast. The earlier danger on our open flank in the south was removed by the proximity of 16th Army's 1 Corps, which was now drawing near Dino. One consolation was afforded us by the capture from a courier aircraft of a letter bearing the signature of Marshal Voroshilov, whom I had met in Moscow in 1931 and who now commanded the front opposite us. This not only confirmed that very substantial elements of the Soviet armies had been wiped out, but in the same connection referred specifically to the battles around Zoltsi. As long as we had been surrounded, our only links with the rear had been at best by wireless or aircraft. The very moment our lines of communication were restored, however, the usual plethora of paper descended on us. One item deserving special mention was an ominous inquiry telegraphed through from the Supreme Command. Moscow radio, in somewhat premature celebration of our Corps' encirclement, had reported the capture of certain top-secret data on our multiple rocket launcher. The Soviets had obviously taken an intense dislike to this new weapon, with which we were able to fire missiles of flaming oil. Already the Soviet army facing us had wirelessed a warning en clair that if we did not stop using it, they would retaliate with gas. An empty threat, of course, in view of the complete inadequacy of their own chemical warfare defences. In these circumstances, it was understandable that they should make such a song and dance about the capture of this information. Now we were being called upon to explain how a top-secret document could possibly fall into enemy hands. Obviously it had not been taken from the fighting troops, but from a transport column intercepted by the Soviets when they cut our supply route. This sort of thing was liable to happen to any armoured formation operating far ahead of its army front. In response to the Supreme Command's inquiry, we duly reported the facts of the case, adding that to avoid any further censure, we would henceforth refrain from cruising around on our own, some 60 miles behind the enemy lines. On 19th July, we had been informed by Panzer Group HQ that it now planned to send 56 Panzer Corps through Luga to Leningrad. 269 Infantry Division, which was assembled on the Luga road, had already been placed under our command. We still had no success with our proposal that the forces of the Panzer Group be at long last concentrated for concerted action, preferably up north with 41 Panzer Corps east of Narva, where there were 4 serviceable roads to Leningrad, rather than along the Luga axis, which ran through extensive woodlands. For the rest, we were first to launch an attack eastwards with 1 corps against the Myshaga sector, which we had already reached once before. Apparently the Supreme Command was still sticking to its plan for a wide outflanking movement, and was even prepared to go round to the east of Lake Ilmen. For the time being, therefore, we and First Corps were involved in fresh battles, in the course of which the enemy was thrown back across the Myshaga. On 20th July, we had a visit from the Oberquartiermeister Wiend of OKH, General Paulus. I put him in the picture about the battles we had fought to date, and pointed out how run down our Panzer Corps had become in country which was most unsuitable for the use of armoured troops. I also drew his attention to the disadvantages of scattering the Panzer Group's resources. The losses of our Corps' 3 mobile divisions already amounted to 6,000 men, and both the troops and equipment were being subjected to excessive strain, even though 8 Panzer Division had been able, during a few days' rest, to bring the number of its serviceable tanks back from 80 up to the 150 marks. I told Paulus that in my opinion the best thing to do would be to withdraw the entire Panzer Group from an area where a rapid advance was almost out of the question, and to use it against Moscow. If, on the other hand, the idea of driving on Leningrad and executing a wide encircling movement through Chudovo were to be maintained, it was essential that infantry be made available. Once the wooded zone had been cleared, our own corps must be saved for the final thrust on the city, otherwise the mobile divisions would reach Leningrad in no fit state for fighting. In any case, I pointed out, such an operation would take time. If we wanted to gain swift possession of Leningrad and the coastline, the only thing to do was to concentrate the whole Panzer Group up north in the area east of Narva, whence it could drive straight for the city. General Paulus entirely agreed with my views. Initially, however, things turned out quite differently. While 16th Army, consisting of 1 corps and another corps which had just arrived, took over the Myshaga front west of Lake Ilmen, it was decided after all that 56 Panzer Corps should now carry out the thrust on Leningrad up the route through Luga. For this purpose, we were allotted 3 motorized infantry division, 269 infantry division, and the newly arrived SS Police Division. This had the effect of dispersing the Panzer Group's mechanized forces further than ever. The SS Death's Head Division remained with 16th Army by Lake Ilmen, and 8 Panzer Division was taken into reserve by the Panzer Group to be initially employed on clearing the communications zone of partisans, a role for which it was not only far too valuable, but also quite unsuitable. The Corps now had only 1 mobile division, 3 motorized, in the Luga area, while 41 Panzer Corps' own 3 were in action east of Narva. The maxim established by Colonel General Guderian on the use of armour was "Klotzen, nicht klecken," don't spatter, boot 'em. In our own case, the very opposite course seemed to have been taken. All our efforts to retain the 3 mobile divisions, irrespective of which way our corps was sent, proved unsuccessful. Experience has long shown that when forces run short, only very few commanders manage to maintain a tidy order of battle and avoid splitting their formations. It would take up too much space here if I were to describe the battles around Luga. They proved very tough indeed. While the enemy had had only a very modest number of troops available in this area a few weeks previously, he had now brought his strength up to a full corps of 3 divisions supported by strong artillery and armour. To cap this, the country around Luga was a Russian training area, with which, of course, the enemy was intimately acquainted, and in addition he had had time to dig himself in properly. While these battles were still in progress, our corps was given a new task. At long last, it was to join up with 41 Panzer Corps in the north for the assault on Leningrad. Even now, however, only Corps HQ and 3 motorized division were involved. 8 Panzer and the SS Death's Head Division were to continue in their present role. On 15th of August, we handed over at Luga to HQ 50 Corps under General Lindemann, an old friend of mine from World War I days, and began moving north. The route to our new command post on Lake Samro, 25 miles southwest of Narva, was so bad that we took 8 hours to travel a distance of 125 miles. We had hardly reached Lake Samro late that evening when a telephone call was received from Panzer Group HQ ordering us to halt 3 motorized division, which was coming up behind us, and to drive straight down south again next morning to report to HQ 16th Army in Dino. We, together with 3 motorized division and the SS Death's Head division, which was being pulled over from Lake Ilmen, were now to join that formation. No one will pretend that we were particularly pleased at these peregrinations. The one admirable exception was our quartermaster, Major Kleinschmidt, whose cheerful equanimity was quite undaunted by the news that he would have to swing his supply and transport arrangements round through an angle of 180 degrees. So, on 16th of August, we moved back to Dino along the same dreadful route we had covered the day before. This time the distance was 160 miles, and we took 13 hours to do it. Luckily, 3 motorized had not come too far north and could be turned round in good time, but what the troops thought of it all I do not care to imagine. The ultimate reason for the change was probably that our sum total of forces was inadequate, and that the whole area between Leningrad, Pskov and Lake Ilmen was thoroughly unsuitable as tank country. The picture we were given on our arrival at HQ 16th Army was the following. 10 corps, fighting on the right wing of the army south of Lake Ilmen, had been attacked and pushed back by far superior enemy forces. 38th Soviet Army, comprising 8 divisions and cavalry formations. It was now fighting a difficult defensive battle south of Lake Ilmen, on a front facing south, with the enemy obviously trying to outflank it in the west. 56 Panzer Corps was to provide the urgently needed relief. Map 9. What our corps had to do, if possible without attracting the attention of the enemy, was to introduce its 2 mechanized divisions into his western flank east of Dino in order to roll up the front while he was busy attacking our own 10 corps in the north. The task confronting us was a pretty one, and it was gratifying to see how pleased the SS were to come back under our command. It was only a pity that we could not get 8 Panzer Division released for such a worthwhile operation. By 18th August, the carefully concealed move of the 2 divisions into camouflaged assembly areas in the enemy's western flank had been successfully completed, and when the corps unleashed its attack early next day, the enemy was obviously taken completely by surprise. Our plan to roll up the enemy front from the flank proved entirely successful, and in the engagements that followed, we and 10 corps, which had now returned to the attack, jointly succeeded in roundly defeating 38th Soviet Army. By 22nd August, we had reached the Lovat southeast of Staraya Russa, despite the fact that in that sandy terrain, with its almost complete absence of roads, the infantry of the 2 motorized divisions had to advance most of the way on foot. During those few days, 56 Panzer Corps alone captured 12,000 prisoners, 141 tanks, 246 guns, and several hundred automatic weapons and motor vehicles. The booty included 2 extremely interesting items. One was a brand new 8.8 cm anti-aircraft battery of German manufacture from the year 1941. The other was the very first Soviet salvo gun to fall into German hands. As I was most anxious to have the latter evacuated, I was all the more indignant to find that it could not be moved because somebody had helped himself to the tyres. The offender proved to be none other than my second assistant, Major Niemann, who had discovered that these tyres fitted our own command wagon. He looked somewhat crestfallen when told to hand them back for reassembly, while the fighting troops, who once again had to exert themselves to the utmost, were enjoying a brief rest on the Lovat. There was talk of withdrawing 56 Panzer Corps for employment elsewhere. But then 16th Army's eastward advance south of Lake Ilmen was resumed after all. At the end of August, however, the first rains of that summer set in, turning every road into such a quagmire that for a while both motorized divisions were completely stuck. At the same time, the enemy moved up new forces. In lieu of his beaten 38th Army, 3 new armies appeared along the Kulm-Ilmen front opposite our own 16th Army, the 27th, 34th and 11th. Fresh battles ensued, but to describe these in detail would take up too much space. 56 Panzer Corps forced a crossing over the Pola and pushed on to a point just short of Demyansk. Quite apart from the fact that enemy resistance was stiffening, the painful effort of advancing a long road several feet deep in mud imposed a particular strain on both men and equipment. During this period, the whole of my time was spent out with my divisions, but even my sturdy Kubelwagen often had to be towed by a tractor to make any headway on those so-called roads. During this period, even we came to feel the divergence between the aims pursued by Hitler, Leningrad, and OKH, Moscow. The commander of 16th Army, Colonel General Bush, told me he intended to push east as far as the Valdai Heights so that he could later advance in the direction Kalinin-Moscow. It seemed that HQ Northern Army Group did not agree, principally because it was worried by the prospect of bearing the army's eastern flank. While at the beginning of September, 57 Panzer Corps intervened in our operations from the area of Central Army Group in the south, we ourselves were told on 12th September that we would shortly be moved south with 3 motorized division to come under command of 9th Army in Central Army Group. Even as a corps commander, one could make neither head nor tail of all this chopping and changing, though I did form the impression that it was all ultimately due to the tug-of-war evidently going on between Hitler and OKH over whether the strategic aim should be Moscow or Leningrad. At all events, the battles which 16th Army fought in those weeks with 56 Panzer Corps taking part were continuously successful, and on 16th September, OKW was able to announce the defeat of substantial elements of the 11th, 27th and 34th Soviet armies. 9 enemy divisions were considered to have been destroyed, and 9 more badly battered. We still failed to find any real satisfaction in these achievements, however, for no one was clear any longer what the actual aim of our strategy was, or what higher purpose all these battles were supposed to serve. Whatever else might happen, the period of sensational advances of the kind we had made on Dvinsk was at an end. My days at the head of 56 Panzer Corps were now numbered. On the evening of 12th September, under a steady downpour of rain, I was sitting in my tent with 1 or 2 officers of my staff. Ever since it had begun to get dark early, we had taken to playing bridge to while away the time until the evening situation reports came in. Suddenly the telephone rang at my elbow, and I was asked to take a call from my friend Bush, the army commander. A telephone message at this late hour did not usually bode anything pleasant, but on this occasion Bush read me out an order that had come over the teleprinter from OKH. General of the Infantry versus Manstein will leave forthwith for Southern Army Group to assume command of 11th Army. Every soldier will sense how proud and happy I felt at the prospect of leading a whole army from now on. To me, at the time, this seemed the peak of my military career. Early next morning I took leave, only by telephone, unfortunately, of the divisions under my command, and then bade farewell to my own staff. In doing so, I had grateful memories of all that 56 Panzer Corps and its staff had achieved in the past months, when the headquarters and divisions had grown into a thoroughly integrated unit. Joyful though I was in taking over this new and bigger task, I was nevertheless fully aware that probably the most satisfying phase of my life as a soldier was now over. For 3 whole months I had lived close to the fighting troops, sharing not only their trials and tribulations, but also the pride of their successes. Time and again I had been able to derive fresh energy from the very fact of this common experience, from the cheerful devotion with which everyone went about his duty, and from the intimacy of comradeship. From now on, my position would prevent me from working among the troops to the extent I had done to date. It was unlikely that I should ever again live through anything comparable to the impetuous dash of 56 Panzer Corps in the first days of the campaign, the fulfillment of all a tank force commander's dreams. I thus found the leave-taking extremely hard, most of all from my experienced Chief of Staff, Colonel Baron V's Elverfelt, a cool, high-minded and never-failing counsellor. The same applied to my high-spirited and talented Chief of Operations, Major Detlefsen, the head of my intelligence branch, Guido versus Kessel, and that indefatigable quartermaster, Major Kleinschmidt. Another of those I had to leave behind me was the head of my Adjutant General's branch, Major V.D. Marwitz, who had joined us only a few weeks previously, and with whom I had close ties of friendship dating back to the days we had spent together in Pomerania and at the military academy. When I left on the morning of 13th of September to take formal leave of my friend Bush, the only people I could take with me were my ADC, Specht, and my two drivers, Nagel and Schumann. Not one of them is alive today. If I now attempt to describe the battles fought in the Crimea by 11th Army and its Romanian fellow combatants, my main reason for doing so is to commemorate my comrades of the Crimean Army. At the same time, I should like to give the men who survived those battles a general account of the events of which they could have had only an incomplete picture at the time. These men put up a tremendous performance in the period 1941-2, fighting one battle after another against an adversary who almost invariably outnumbered them. In attack and pursuit, their aggressive spirit was unparalleled, and when the situation appeared hopeless, they would stand and fight unflinchingly. Often they may not have known what compelled us to make demands on them that seemed impossible to fulfill, or why they were flung from one action to another and from one front to the next. And yet they went to the very limit of endurance to carry out these demands, reciprocating the trust of those who led them. But 11th Army's campaign in the Crimea also deserves attention outside the immediate circle of its participants, for it is one of the few cases where an army was still able to operate independently in a segregated theatre of war, left to its own devices and free of interference from the Supreme Command. It was a campaign which, in 10 months of incessant fighting, included both offensive and defensive battles, mobile warfare with full freedom of action, a headlong pursuit operation, landings by an enemy in control of the sea, partisan engagements, and an assault on a powerfully defended fortress. Finally, the campaign is of interest because it was fought over the Black Sea Peninsula, which even today bears traces of the Greeks, Goths, Genoese, and Tartars. Once before, in the War of 1854-6, this had been a focal point of history, and the names of places which played a role then, the Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, and Malakoff, will be heard here all over again. Operationally, however, the War of 1854-6 can in no way be compared with the campaign fought in 1941-2. In the former case, the Western powers enjoyed naval supremacy and all the advantages this implies, whereas in the Crimean campaign of 1941-2, it was the Russians who controlled the Black Sea. Our 11th Army had not only to conquer the Crimea and Sevastopol, but also to contend with all the possibilities open to the Russians by reason of their mastery at sea. On 17th September 1941, I arrived at 11th Army HQ in Nikolaev, the Russian naval base at the mouth of the Bug, and took over command. My predecessor, Colonel General Ritter versus Schobert, had been buried in the city the day before. On one of his daily visits to the front, he had landed on a Russian minefield in his Fieseler Storch aircraft, and both he and his pilot had been killed. In him, the German army lost an officer of great integrity and one of its most experienced front-line soldiers. His troops would have followed him anywhere. HQ 11th. Army, whose operations staff was later to form the headquarters of Don Army Group, was almost without exception a superb team of men, and I have grateful memories of the assistance I received from so many splendid officers in 2.5 tough years of war. We got on extraordinarily well together, and when I relinquished my command in 1944, many of them did not want to remain on the staff. The novelty of my new position did not end with the expansion of my sphere of command from an army corps into an army. I did not discover until I reached Nikolaev that in addition to 11th Army, I was also to take over 3rd Romanian Army, which was affiliated to it. For political reasons, the actual chain of command in this part of the Eastern Front had not been easy to arrange. Command of the Allied forces committed from Romania, 3rd and 4th Romanian Armies and 11th German Army, had been entrusted to the Romanian head of state, Marshal Antonescu, but at the same time he was bound by the directives of Southern Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Verser Rundstedt, HQ. 11th Army had been acting as the connecting link between the Marshal and Army Group HQ, and had advised him on operational matters. By the time I arrived, however, the situation was such that Antonescu only retained control of 4th Romanian Army, which he had directed to attack Odessa. The other Romanian army taking part in the campaign, the 3rd, had been placed under the command of 11th Army, which henceforth took its orders directly from HQ Southern Army Group. At the best of times, it is embarrassing for an army headquarters to have to control another self-contained army in addition to its own, and the task was necessarily twice as difficult when the army in question happened to be an Allied one. What made things harder still was that there were not only certain differences of organisation, training and leadership between the two armies, as is always the case where allies are concerned, but also a noticeable contrast in their fighting qualities. From time to time, this led us to take a firmer hand in our allies' handling of an operation than was usual with our own forces or desirable in the interest of good relations. That we were able, despite these difficulties, to collaborate with the Romanian headquarters staffs and fighting units without any real friction occurring was primarily due to the loyalty of the commander of 3rd Romanian Army, General, later Colonel General, Dumitrescu. The German liaison teams, which we had attached to all Romanian staffs down to divisional level, also contributed by their tact, and when necessary by their firmness, to this cooperation. The man most deserving of mention in this respect, however, is Marshal Antonescu. Whatever verdict posterity may pass on him as a politician, Antonescu was a real patriot, a good soldier, and certainly our most loyal ally. He was a soldier who, having once bound up his country's destiny with that of the Reich, did everything possible until his overthrow to put Romania's military power and war potential to effective use on our side. If this did not always work out quite as he had hoped, the reason was to be found in the internal circumstances of his state and his regime. At all events, he remained faithful to his allies, and I can only speak with gratitude of our work together. As for the Romanian army, there is no doubt that it had considerable weaknesses. Although the Romanian soldier, who was usually of peasant origin, was modest in his wants and usually a capable, brave fighter, the possibilities of training him as an individual fighting man who could think for himself in action, let alone as a non-commissioned officer, were to a great extent limited by the low standard of general education in Romania. In cases where members of the German minority did come up to the necessary standard, Romanian national prejudice tended to impede any advancement. Neither were such outmoded practices as flogging likely to improve the quality of the rank and file. Their effect was rather to make Romanian soldiers of German stock do everything they could to join one of the German armed services, or, since the latter were not allowed to accept them, the Waffen-SS. One disadvantage, as far as the inner stability of Romanian troops was concerned, was the absence of a non-commissioned officer corps as we know it. I am afraid people in Germany nowadays are all too ready to forget what a debt we have owed in the past to our excellent body of regular NCOs. Another factor of far-reaching importance was that a considerable proportion of the Romanian officers holding senior and medium appointments were not up to requirement. Most of all, the Romanians lacked that close link between officers and men, which tends to be taken for granted in the German army. Man management with them was entirely devoid of the Prussian tradition. Because they had no war experience, the combat training of the Romanians fell short of the exigencies of modern warfare. This led to unnecessary losses, which in turn was bound to affect morale. The military leaders, who had been under French influence since 1918, still thought in terms of World War I. Weapons and equipment were partly obsolete and also inadequate. This was particularly true of the anti-tank units, with the result that they could hardly be expected to hold their ground against Soviet tank attacks. Whether Germany could not have rendered more effective help in this respect is a question for others to decide. One final drawback regarding the use of Romanian troops on the Eastern Front was their terrific respect for the Russians. In difficult situations, this was liable to end in a panic. Indeed, it is a problem of which account must be taken in any war against Russia involving Southeast European nations. In the case of the Bulgarians and Serbs, the insecurity is increased by their sense of Slavonic affinity. There was one other factor that could not be entirely disregarded in any assessment of the combat efficiency of Romanian troops. At the time with which we are dealing, Romania had already attained her fundamental war aim, the reconquest of Bessarabia. Even Transnistria, the territory between the Dniester and Bug, which she had been persuaded to accept by Hitler, did not really lie within the scope of Romania's aspirations. It was understandable that the idea of pushing even further into the Russia they dreaded so much was none too warmly received by many Romanians. Despite all the defects and reservations mentioned above, however, the Romanian troops performed their duty as best they could. Above all, they always readily submitted to German military leadership and did not, like other allies of ours, put matters of prestige before material necessity. Undoubtedly, the soldierly mentality of Marshal Antonescu exerted a decisive influence in this respect. To sum up, the verdict given me at the time by my advisers was that in the event of any substantial losses, 3rd Romanian Army would cease to be capable of offensive action and only be fit for defence if reinforced by German corset bones. The sector I had to command formed the southernmost wing of the Eastern Front. Broadly speaking, it embraced the Crimea and the part of the Dnieper Bend south of Zaporozhye. There was no direct contact with the main forces of Southern Army Group advancing north of the Dnieper, which was all to the good as far as 11th Army's operational freedom was concerned. After the forest tracts of northern Russia, in which I had last had to operate with a tank corps unsuited to that type of country, I now found myself in the vast expanses of the steppes, which were almost entirely devoid of natural obstacles, even if they did not offer any cover either. It was ideal tank country, but unfortunately 11th Army had no tanks. The only variety was offered by the smaller rivers, the beds of which dried up in summertime to form deep, steep-banked fissures known as bulkers. Nevertheless, the very monotony of the steppes gave them a strange and unique fascination. Everyone was captivated at one time or other by the endlessness of the landscape, through which it was possible to drive for hours on end, often guided only by the compass, without encountering the least rise in the ground or setting eyes on a single human being or habitation. The distant horizon seemed like some mountain ridge behind which a paradise might beckon, but it only stretched on and on. The poles of the Anglo-Iranian telegraph line, built some years before by Siemens, alone served to break the eternal sameness of it all. Yet at sunset these steppes were transformed into a dazzling blaze of colour. In the eastern part of the Nogaisk steppes, around and northeast of Melitopol, one came upon lovely villages with such German names as Karlsruhe and Helenenthal. They lay in the midst of rich fruit plantations, their well-built stone houses bearing witness to a past prosperity. The inhabitants still spoke the purest German, but they were almost all old men, women and children. The men had been deported by the Soviet authorities. The task assigned to 11th Army by the Supreme Command inevitably committed it in two divergent directions. On one hand, by advancing on the right wing of Southern Army Group, it was intended to continue pursuing the enemy as he withdrew eastwards. To this end, the main body of the army was to be brought forward along the north coast of the Sea of Azov in the general direction of Rostov. On the other hand, the army was also meant to take the Crimea, a task given special priority. One reason for this was the favourable effect the capture of the peninsula was expected to have on the attitude of Turkey. Another, even more pressing one, was the threat of the enemy's big Crimean air bases to the Romanian oil fields, so vital to Germany. After the Crimea had been taken, the 11th Army's corps of mountain troops was to move over the Straits of Kerch towards the Caucasus, evidently to reinforce an offensive beyond Rostov. At that time, therefore, the Supreme Command still had pretty far-reaching aims for the 1941 campaign. It was soon to become apparent that the dual role allotted to 11th Army was unrealistic. At the beginning of September, 11th Army had forced a crossing over the lower Dnieper at Berislavl, an exceptional feat of arms in which the main part had been played by 22 Lower Saxon Infantry Division. Nonetheless, it marked the point where the duality of the army's task inevitably brought about a cleavage in its axis of advance. When I took command, I found myself confronted by the following situation. 2 army corps, 30 corps under General Versasalmuth, 72 and 22 infantry divisions and the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and 49 mountain corps under General Kubier, 170 infantry division and 1 and 4 mountain divisions, had continued their eastward pursuit of the enemy after his defeat on the Dnieper and were approaching the line from Melitopol to the Dnieper bend south of Zaporozhye. 1 corps, the 54th under General Hansen, had been diverted to the approach to the Crimea, the Perekop Isthmus. 50 Infantry Division, which had come from Greece, was partly under 4th Romanian Army before Odessa and partly engaged in mopping up the Black Sea coast. 3rd Romanian Army, comprising a mountain corps, 1, 2 and 4 mountain brigades, and a cavalry corps, 5, 6 and 8 cavalry brigades, was still west of the Dnieper, where it proposed to rest for a while. In doing so, it was probably guided by a desire to avoid any advance beyond the river, since it had already exceeded Romania's political aims in having to cross the Bug. Faced with this dual mission of pursuing the enemy eastwards to Rostov and conquering the Crimea for a subsequent drive through Kerch to the Caucasus, 11th Army headquarters had to decide whether to deal with the 2 divergent tasks simultaneously or in chronological order. A decision which was really the responsibility of the Supreme Command was thus left to an army. It seemed quite certain that both tasks could not be solved simultaneously with the forces we had at our disposal. The capture of the Crimea called for a considerably stronger force than 54 Corps, now facing Perekop. Although the intelligence picture indicated that only 3 divisions of the enemy army were likely to have escaped from the Dnieper into the isthmus, it was not clear what forces the Russians had available in the Crimea itself, particularly at Sevastopol. Soon afterwards it emerged that the enemy could put not 3, but 6 divisions into action in the isthmus itself. These were later to be reinforced by the Soviet army then defending Odessa, i.e. from the sea, Tata. In view of the nature of the ground, however, a stubborn defence by even 3 enemy divisions would probably suffice to deny 54 Corps access to the Crimea, or at least to cause it considerable losses in the fight through the isthmus. The Crimea is divided from the mainland by the so-called Lazy Sea, the Zivash. This is a kind of mudflat or brackish swamp, almost impassable for infantry and an absolute obstacle to assault boats on account of its extreme shallowness. There are only 2 firm approaches to the Crimea, the isthmus of Perekop in the west and a neck of land running west of Genichesk in the east. The latter is so narrow in places as only to leave room for a causeway and railway embankment, both of which are interspersed with long stretches of bridges. For the purpose of an attack, therefore, it was quite useless. As even the Perekop Isthmus was less than 5 miles wide, the assault would have to be purely frontal and over ground quite devoid of cover. A flanking attack was ruled out by the proximity of the sea on either side. In addition to being already equipped with strong field defences, the isthmus was cut straight across the middle by Tartar's Ditch, an ancient earthwork anything up to 50 feet in depth. Once the Perekop Isthmus had been broken through, there was another bottleneck to be tackled further south at Ishun, where salt lakes reduced the potential assault front to a mere 2 miles. In view of these difficulties on the ground and the enemy's superiority in the air, we had to expect a hard and exhausting struggle. Even if we succeeded in breaking through at Perekop, it was doubtful whether the corps would still have the strength to fight a second battle at Ishun. In any case, 2 or 3 divisions would never be enough to conquer the whole of Crimea, including Sevastopol. To ensure a swift occupation of Crimea, therefore, the army had at all costs to detach strong additional forces from its pursuit group now heading eastwards. What remained should still suffice for the pursuit as long as the enemy continued to withdraw, though it would be too weak for an objective as remote as Rostov if he were to form a new front further back or actually bring up fresh forces. Should it be considered crucial to advance on Rostov, Crimea would have to be left behind for the time being. In that event, however, it would be difficult to tell when, if ever, the forces needed to conquer the peninsula could be made available. Besides, in the hands of an enemy with command of the sea, Crimea was liable to become a serious menace deep in the flank of the Eastern Front, quite apart from the fact that the air bases would continue to threaten the Romanian oil fields. If the attempt were made to conduct a far-reaching operation towards and beyond Rostov with 2 army corps, and simultaneously to conquer Crimea with 1 other corps, the only result could be that neither objective would be effectively attained. 11th Army accordingly decided to give priority to Crimea. At all costs, we were determined not to tackle this task with insufficient forces. As a matter of course, 54 Corps was given all the available army artillery, engineers and anti-aircraft guns, in addition to which it was to call forward 50 Infantry Division from its rear location at the latest in time for the second phase, the battle for the Ishun Isthmus. But this was still not enough. It was imperative to have a second corps to conquer Crimea quickly after the breakthrough, if indeed it were not actually needed to fight through the lakes at Ishun. We decided that this should be the German Mountain Corps, which the Supreme Command had anyway earmarked in its directives to be moved up through Kerch to the Caucasus later on. Meanwhile, this formation of 2 divisions could be put to better use in the mountainous parts of southern Crimea than out in the steppes. Apart from all this, an attempt was to be made, once we had broken into the peninsula itself, to take the fortress of Sevastopol by a surprise thrust with motorized units. For this purpose, the Leibstandarte was to assemble behind 54 Corps when it went into the assault. These dispositions naturally entailed a considerable weakening of the army's eastern front. All that could be found to replace the forces there, apart from the elements of 22 Infantry Division being used on coastal defence north of Crimea, was 3rd Romanian Army. Despite the Romanian inhibitions to which I alluded earlier, I was able to arrange in a personal talk with General Dumitrescu that his army should be moved quickly forward over the Dnieper. It was perfectly clear that the measures taken by 11th Army would involve considerable risks if the enemy on its eastern front were to halt his retreat and try to regain the initiative there. This was the price that had to be paid if we were to avoid attempting the capture of Crimea with inadequate forces. While supply difficulties caused the preparations for 54 Corps' attack on the Perekop Isthmus to drag on till 24th September, and our forces were still regrouping on the lines already indicated, there were signs of a change in the situation on the army's eastern front from 21st September onwards. The enemy had taken up prepared positions along a front from west of Melitopol to the Dnieper Bend, with the result that the pursuit had to be discontinued. Nonetheless, the army went ahead with the disengagement of the German Mountain Corps, giving orders for the remaining German formations to be mixed in with those of 3rd Romanian Army in order to keep the risk down to a minimum. The Romanian Cavalry Corps in the southern sector of this front was incorporated into 30 German corps, while 3rd Romanian Army in the north took over 170 German Infantry Division to bolster the Romanian Mountain Corps. By 24th September 54th Corps was able to move into the assault on the Perekop Isthmus. Though given maximum artillery support, 45 and 73 infantry divisions had the hardest possible conditions to fight under, having to advance in blazing sunshine across salt steppes on which there was no trace of water or cover. The enemy had transformed the isthmus into a powerful 10-mile-deep defence system, and he fought bitterly for every single trench and strong point. Nevertheless, after warding off strong enemy counterattacks, the Corps took Perekop and crossed Tartars Ditch on 26th of September. 3 more days' intensive fighting saw it through the rest of the enemy's defence zone, and after the capture of the strongly defended locality of Armyansk, out into more open country. The enemy fell back between the Ishun lakes, having suffered heavy losses in killed and left 10,000 prisoners, 112 tanks and 135 guns in our hands. But the fruit of this hard-won victory, the final breakout into Crimea, could still not be plucked. Although the enemy's losses had been heavy, the number of divisions facing the Corps had meanwhile risen to 6. In all likelihood, any attempt to go straight ahead with the storming of the Ishun bottleneck would have been too much for our troops, in view of the relative strengths involved and the tremendous sacrifices it would have imposed on the German Corps. As for 11th Army's proposal to have reinforcements to hand at this juncture in the form of the Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte, the enemy had already thwarted it. Obviously anticipating that we were intent on a speedy conquest of the Crimea, he had brought fresh forces up to his front between the Sea of Azov and the Dnieper. Here, on 26th of September, he had attacked our army's eastern front with 2 new armies, the 18th and 9th, consisting of 12 divisions which were mainly new arrivals or recently rested. In the first assault, he had admittedly failed to score any successes against our own 30 Corps, though even here the situation became pretty tense. But in the sector of 3rd Romanian Army, he had overrun the latter's 4 mountain brigade and torn a gap 10 miles wide in the army front. The brigade in question had lost the bulk of its artillery and seemed to be at the end of its tether. Both the other Romanian mountain brigades had also suffered severe losses. We now had no choice but to make the German Mountain Corps, which was already on its way to the Perekop Isthmus, do a right-about turn in order to set about restoring the position of 3rd Romanian Army. Simultaneously, moreover, 11th Army was virtually deprived of the services of its one fast-moving formation, the Leibstandarte, as we were now ordered by the Supreme Command to hold it in hand for the drive on Rostov as part of 1st Panzer Group, to which it would shortly be transferred. We thus had to abstain from using the Leibstandarte to exploit the success in the isthmus, and it was likewise ordered back to the eastern front. In order to be close to the Army's 2 fronts, the Army Operations Branch had on 21st September established a tactical headquarters at Askania Nova in the Nogaisk steppes, which had once been the property of a German family, the Pfalz-Feins. Formerly a model estate known all over Russia, it had now become a collective farm. The manor buildings were sadly neglected, and the retreating Soviet troops had destroyed all the machinery, just as they had thrown petrol over the mountains of threshed wheat lying out in the open air and set them on fire. The latter smouldered for weeks on end without our being able to extinguish them. The increasing gravity of the situation on the Army's front impelled us to move close up behind the danger spot, with a small tactical staff on 29th September. This is always an expedient measure in times of crisis, if only because it prevents subordinate staffs from pulling out early and making a bad impression on the troops. On the occasion in question, it was particularly appropriate in view of the tendency of many Romanian headquarters staffs to change their locations prematurely. The same day, the German Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte delivered a thrust into the enemy's southern flank, where he had broken into 3rd Romanian Army, but had failed to exploit his initial success properly. While it was possible to restore the situation in this area, a fresh crisis was brewing on the northern wing of 30 Corps, where a Romanian cavalry brigade had given way. I had to intervene vigorously there and then to prevent its hasty withdrawal. The threatened breakthrough was then parried by swinging round the Leibstandarte to meet it. Tense though the situation on our eastern front had become as a result of the events described above, it also had the makings of a golden opportunity. By launching repeated attacks to frustrate our intentions in the Crimea, the enemy had tied both his armies down on a frontal basis, and obviously now had no further reserves with which to protect himself against the Dnieper crossings at Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, whence General versus Kleist's 1st Panzer Group could break out against his northern flank. After I had made representations to Southern Army Group some days previously in favour of an intervention from this quarter, the appropriate orders were issued on 1st October. While 11th Army kept a tight hold on the still attacking enemy, the Panzer Group steadily increased its pressure from the north. Now the enemy began to yield, and by 1st October it was the turn of 30 Corps and 3rd Romanian Army to go over to the attack. In the next few days, in cooperation with 1st Panzer Group, we succeeded in encircling the mass of both enemy armies in the area Bol, Tokmak, Mariupol, Berdyansk, or in destroying them as they retreated. Some 65,000 prisoners, 125 tanks and over 500 guns found their way into German hands on this occasion. Following the Battle of the Sea of Azov, a change was made in the order of battle of the German southern wing. The Supreme Command seemed to have realized that no army could simultaneously fight one operation in the direction of Rostov and another in the Crimea, and from now on the advance on Rostov was entrusted to 1st Panzer Group, to which 11th Army was ordered to hand over 49 Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte. 11th Army was given the sole task of conquering the Crimea with its 2 remaining army corps. Of these, 30 Corps comprised 22, 72 and 170 infantry divisions, and 54 Corps was composed of 46, 73 and 50 infantry divisions, 1/3 of the last named being still outside Odessa. 3rd Romanian Army, which now reverted to the command of Marshal Antonescu, was merely to be responsible for coastal defence on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. After I had approached the Marshal directly, however, he agreed to let me take the headquarters of the Romanian Mountain Corps, with 1 cavalry and 1 mountain brigade under command, into the Crimea to screen the eastern coastline. Now that 11th Army's mission was reduced to the single aim of conquering the Crimea, however, the Supreme Command became all the more impatient for a corps to be put across the Straits of Kerch towards the Kuban at the earliest possible date. Realizing from this demand how much Hitler was underestimating the enemy, 11th Army felt impelled to point out that the prior conditions for any such operation must be the complete clearance of the Crimea. The enemy would undoubtedly fight to the last for the peninsula and would abandon Odessa rather than Sevastopol. Indeed, as long as the Soviets had even 1 foot in the Crimea, there could be no question of throwing part of 11th Army, which had only 2 corps anyway, through Kerch to the Kuban. As it was, we took this opportunity to put in a bid for an extra corps of 3 divisions, and within the next few weeks, primarily, one would suppose, because of Hitler's above-mentioned requirement, the army was augmented by 42 corps headquarters and 132 and 24 infantry divisions. In consequence of the Russians' desperate efforts to hold on to the Crimea, these reinforcements were to prove indispensable for the peninsular battles alone. The immediate problem, however, was to resume the struggle for the approaches to the Crimea and to open up the way through Ishun. Just another assault operation, one might say. Yet that 10-day battle towers above the normal type of offensive action as a shining example of the aggressive spirit and self-sacrifice of the German soldier. In it, we lacked almost all the advantages which are generally regarded as prior necessities for an attack on fortified positions. Numerical superiority was on the side of the Soviet defenders, not of the German attackers. 11th Army's total of 6 divisions was very soon confronted by 8 Soviet rifle and 4 cavalry divisions, for on 16th of October the Russians had evacuated the fortress of Odessa, until then the object of so many unsuccessful assaults by 4th Romanian Army, and transferred the defending army to the Crimea by sea. Despite the Luftwaffe's claim to have sunk 32,000 tons of shipping, the bulk of the convoys from Odessa had still made a landfall at Sevastopol or harbours along the west coast of the peninsula. The first divisions of this Soviet army duly appeared at the battlefront shortly after the start of our offensive. The German artillery was certainly superior to the enemy's and effectively supported the attacking infantry. But on the enemy side, armour-plated coastal batteries were able to intervene from the northwest coast of the Crimea and the southern bank of the Zivash without the German guns initially being able to get to grips with them. And while the Russians had abundant armour to draw on for their counterattacks, 11th Army did not possess a single tank. Above all, senior commanders had hardly any opportunity to lighten the troops' arduous task by tactical manoeuvre. In that situation, it was quite impossible to take the enemy by surprise, since all he had to do was to sit in his well-constructed fieldworks and wait for the assault to develop. As had been the case at Perekop, the sea on one side and the Zivash on the other excluded any possibility of outflanking or even enfilading the enemy. On the contrary, it was necessary to carry the attack forward purely frontally along the 3 narrow strips of land into which the isthmus was divided by the lakes lying within it. The breadth of these 3 strips allowed us to commit only the 3 divisions of 54 Corps, 73, 46 and 22, in the first instance, 30 Corps being unable to go in until a certain amount of elbow room had been gained further south. The salt steppes of the isthmus, flat as a pancake and bare of vegetation, offered no cover whatever to the attacker. Yet the air above them was dominated by the Soviet Air Force, whose fighters and fighter bombers dived incessantly on any target they could find. Not only the frontline infantry and field batteries had to dig in, it was even necessary to dig pits for every vehicle and horse behind the battle zone as protection against enemy aircraft. Things got so bad that anti-aircraft batteries no longer dared to fire in case they were immediately wiped out from the air. Not until the last days of the offensive, after Mulders and his fighter group had been called in to assist the army, could the sky be kept clear, and even then only in the hours of daylight. At night time, not even Mulders could help. Under such combat conditions, and in the face of an opponent who stubbornly defended every inch of ground, the demands made on the attacking troops were bound to be abnormally high, and their losses very considerable. Throughout this period, I was constantly on the road to see for myself how things were going and what assistance could be rendered to the fighting units in their difficult struggle. I was alarmed by the way fighting power deteriorated. The divisions carrying out this tough assignment had already made heavy sacrifices at Perekop or in the Azov battle, and the time came when one wondered whether the struggle for the narrow corridors could possibly succeed, or, assuming that we did manage to break through, whether our forces would still be equal to winning the Crimea from an enemy whose strength was constantly on the increase. By 25th October, the troops seemed too exhausted to go on with the attack. Twice already the commander of one particularly good division had reported that the regiments under his command were at the end of their strength. This was the hour that usually comes sooner or later in such a contest, when the outcome of the battle is on the razor's edge. It was the hour that must show whether the will of the attacker to exert himself to the very limit of physical endurance is stronger than that of the defender to go on resisting. The struggle of deciding whether to call for a last supreme effort, at the risk of having ultimately demanded all that sacrifice in vain, is one that can only be fought out in the heart of the commander concerned. It would be pointless, however, were it not inspired by the confidence of the troops and their determination not to give up the fight. 11th Army was not prepared. After all, it had had to ask of the fighting troops to throw victory away through its own weakness at what might be 1 minute to 12. As it turned out, the unbroken aggressive spirit of the troops overcame even the enemy's grim resolution to hold out. After one more day of hard effort, 27th October brought the final success. On 18th October, at the end of 10 days of the most bitter fighting, the Soviet defence collapsed. 11th Army could take up the pursuit. The chase which followed gave one more splendid example of the boldness and initiative of commanders at all levels and the self-denial of the fighting troops. The sight of those regiments, weakened by their heavy losses and well-nigh exhausted by the unprecedented demands of the campaign, yet racing towards the tempting goal of the South Crimean coast, put one in mind of the soldiers of another army who in 1796 stormed the fields of Italy promised them by Napoleon. By 16th November, the furious chase was over, and the whole of the Crimea, except for the fortified area of Sevastopol, was in our hands. The 6 divisions of 11th Army had wiped out the best part of 2 enemy armies, totalling 12 rifle and 4 cavalry divisions. Of his initial strength of around 200,000 men, the enemy had lost over 100,000 as prisoners in the struggle for the 2 necks of land and the pursuit that followed, as well as 700 guns and 160 tanks. What troops had been able to escape across the Straits of Kerch or into Sevastopol were mere debris and without any heavy weapons. The fact that those taking refuge in the fortress could immediately be reformed into proper units was due to the enemy's command of the sea, which enabled him to bring in replacements and stores with a minimum of delay. While the administrative branches of 11th Army HQ moved into Simferopol, the largely Russianized capital of the Crimea lying in beautiful surroundings on the northern edge of the Yaila Mountains, our tactical headquarters went to Zarabus, a sizable village north of the city, where we found very suitable accommodation in one of the new schools built by the Soviets in almost all the bigger country places. I personally lived with the Chief of Staff in the small farmhouse of the fruit-growing collective, where each of us had a modest room to himself. The furniture in my own consisted of a bed, a table and chair, a stool for the wash bowl to stand on, and a few clothes hooks. Naturally, we could have obtained some furniture from Simferopol, but our staff did not believe in indulging in comforts which the ordinary soldier had to do without. Except for 2 brief stays at a command post on the Kerch front and the period in which the tactical headquarters was up in front of Sevastopol, we remained in these unpretentious quarters until August 1942. After the nomadic life we had led to date, it was a complete change for all of us, though not necessarily a welcome one. Whenever a formation staff becomes static, the inevitable result is not only a settled day-to-day routine, but also a return to the paper war. I fought the paper war of that winter in my classroom between 2 little brick stoves we had built on the Russian pattern, the heating system having naturally been destroyed by the Soviets. At this point I might touch on a problem which, even though it receded before the grave anxieties which the winter of 1941-2 was to cause us in the operational sphere, was always a matter of great concern to me. The man who commands an army is also its supreme arbiter, and the hardest task that can ever confront him is the confirmation of a death sentence. On one hand, it is his inexorable duty to maintain discipline and, in the troops' own interest, to inflict severe penalties for delinquency in action. On the other, it is a grim thought to know that one can snuff out a human life by a mere signature. Of course, death claims thousands of victims a day in war, and every soldier expects to have to lay down his life. Yet there is a very big difference between falling honourably in battle and facing the muzzles of one's comrades' rifles to be ignominiously erased from the ranks of the living. When, of course, a soldier had besmirched the honour of the army by some base action or culpably brought about the death of his comrades, there could be no mercy. But there were plenty of other cases caused not by sheer baseness of character, but by some perfectly explainable human lapse. Even so, the court-martial concerned had to pass the death sentence according to the full rigour of military law. In no case involving a death sentence was I ever content to base my final decision on the verbal elucidations of my army judges, admirable men though they were, but I always made a careful study of the files myself. When 2 soldiers in my corps were sentenced to death on the outbreak of war for raping and killing an old woman, they only received their just deserts. A very different case was that of a man who, after winning the Iron Cross in the Polish campaign, had been posted to a strange unit following a spell in hospital. On his very first day there, his whole machine gun crew was killed, whereupon he lost his nerve and fled. By law, it is true, his life was forfeit, but there still seemed grounds in this instance, even though the man had been guilty of cowardice and thereby of endangering unit morale, for applying a different yardstick. As I could not immediately quash the sentence passed by the court-martial, the procedure I adopted in this and other such cases was to consult the man's regimental commander and, subject to the latter's agreement, to suspend the sentence for 4 weeks. If the man redeemed himself in action during this time, I quashed the sentence. If he failed again, it was carried out. Of all the condemned men to whom this probationary period was granted, only one went over to the enemy. All the others either proved their worth or died like true soldiers in the heavy fighting in the east. 11th Army's task now was to assault the enemy's last Crimean stronghold, Sevastopol. The sooner this was achieved, the less time the enemy would have to organise his defence, and the greater would be the prospect of success. What was more, it reduced the likelihood of an intervention from the sea. According to our calculations, the necessary troop movements and ammunition dumping would be complete by 27th or 28th November. Consequently, we made this the deadline for the start of the offensive. At this point, the Russian winter overtook us, its impact being all the more devastating by reason of the two different forms it took. In the Crimea itself, the rains came, very soon rendering all the unpaved roads there quite unusable. The mainland in the north, on the other hand, was already in the grip of severe frosts, which promptly immobilized 4 of the only 5 railway engines then available south of the Dnieper. In consequence, 11th Army often found its supplies reduced to as little as 1 or 2 trainloads a day. Though there was ice on the Dnieper, it still would not hold, and so far no ice-free bridges existed, and so the preparations for the assault dragged on. Instead of 27th November, the preliminary bombardment could not start until 17th December. At last, after a 3-week delay which was ultimately to prove crucial, 54 and 30 Corps were able to launch their attacks against the northern and southern sectors respectively. Prior to this, however, 11th Army had a difficult decision to make. On 17th of October, the critical turn of events around Rostov had caused the Army Group to order the immediate handover of 73 and 170 infantry divisions. Despite all our warnings that this would make it impossible to attack Sevastopol, we had only been allowed to keep 170 Division, which was still moving along the coast to join 30 Corps and would not have reached Rostov in time anyway. This concession did not alter the fact that the removal of 73 Division deprived the assault on the northern sector of its necessary reserve element, and we had to make up our minds whether in these circumstances we could afford to attack at all. In the event, we decided to risk it. It is not possible here to describe the course of the attack in detail. The first task was to drive the enemy, by a surprise thrust from the east, from his forward area between the Kacha and Belbek, and at the same time to capture his strong points in the Belbek Valley and along its southern elevation. Thereupon, the assault would be carried forward through the actual fortress Glacis south of the Belbek right up to Severnaya Bay. The main responsibility for the success of this battle lay with the valiant 22 Lower Saxon Infantry Division, under its outstanding commander, Lieutenant General Wolfe. It cleared the forward area between the Kacha and Belbek of the enemy, stormed the heights south of the Belbek Valley with 132 Infantry Division, and drove into the fortified zone proper to the south of the latter. But the spearhead of the attack was steadily narrowing, as 50 and 24 infantry divisions, whose task was to advance towards Severnaya Bay from the east, were not making any real progress in the difficult mountain country, parts of which were overgrown with almost impenetrable bush. The heavy fighting for the pillboxes, which the enemy defended with stubborn determination, was sapping the strength of our troops, and the severe cold to which they were henceforth exposed taxed their energies to the utmost. Nevertheless, in the last few days of December, the struggle having continued all through Christmas, the tip of the spearhead drew near to Fort Stalin, the capture of which would at least have given our artillery visual command of Severnaya Bay. All we needed now were fresh troops, and the drive to the bay was bound to succeed. But these were just what we had lacked since handing over 73 Division, and not even by drastically packing the assault divisions into the spearhead of the attack could we make good the loss. Such was the situation when the Soviet landings struck, first at Kerch and then at Feodosia. The threat was a deadly one, coming as it did at the very moment when the entire forces of the army, except for 1 German division and 2 Romanian brigades, were in action around Sevastopol. It was clear that we should have to throw forces from Sevastopol to the threatened points with the utmost speed. The slightest delay might prove fatal, but ought the attack on Sevastopol to be abandoned just when only one more push seemed necessary to gain command of Severnaya Bay? Furthermore, it would almost certainly be easier to disengage forces from Sevastopol after a success on the northern front than if one were to let go of the enemy prematurely. 11th Army accordingly decided to accept the risk involved in every further hour's postponement of the release of troops from Sevastopol. Initially, only 30 Corps was ordered to halt its assault, and 170 Division was dispatched to the threatened Kerch Peninsula. At the same time, with the agreement of the commander of 54 Corps and his divisional commanders, a final attempt was to be made on the northern front to reach the assault objective, Severnaya Bay. As always, the troops gave everything they had, and 22 Divisions Vanguard, 16 Infantry Regiment under Colonel Versacholtitz actually penetrated the outer ring of Fort Stalin. By then, everyone's strength had given out, and on 30th December, the commanders of the assault divisions reported that no further attempts to carry on with the attack could be expected to succeed. After urgent representations by telephone through Army Group had convinced even Hitler that such action was necessary, 11th Army Headquarters issued orders for the attack to be finally stopped. Over and above this, it was reluctantly compelled to order the withdrawal of the northern front to the heights north of the Belbek Valley. But for these measures, the requisite forces could not have been released, to say nothing of the fact that the situation within the narrow confines of the spearhead would anyway have been untenable in the long run. Hitler's disapproval of this decision, which, though he could do nothing about it, clashed with the strict ban he had just placed on any voluntary withdrawals, weighed little in comparison with one's own responsibility to the troops who had sacrificed so much. And so the first attempt to storm the fortress of Sevastopol had failed. The Stalin offensive to reconquer the Crimea. The landing of Soviet troops on the Kerch Peninsula, catching 11th Army just when the battle on the northern front of Sevastopol had entered its crucial phase, soon proved to be more than a mere diversionary measure on the enemy's part. Soviet radio stations proclaimed that this was an all-out offensive to reconquer the Crimea, planned and commanded by Stalin personally, and that it would not end until 11th Army had been wiped off the map. That the threat was no empty one soon became apparent from the weight of enemy forces committed. Behind them, and in the utter ruthlessness with which they were expended, one sensed the brutal will of Stalin. On 26th of December, after crossing the Straits of Kerch, the enemy had begun by landing 2 divisions on either side of the city. Smaller landings followed on the northern coast of the peninsula. The position of 42 Corps, General Count Sponek, which depended solely on 46 Infantry Division for the defence of the peninsula, was certainly not an enviable one. Count Sponek accordingly requested permission to evacuate the peninsula in the hope that it could be sealed off at Parpash. 11th Army did not agree with him, for if the enemy succeeded in establishing a firm footing at Kerch, the upshot would be a second front in the Crimea, and an extremely dangerous situation for the entire army as long as Sevastopol remained untaken. Consequently, we ordered 42 Corps to strike while the enemy was still off balance after his landing and to hurl him back into the sea. At the same time, in order to keep the whole of 46 Division free for this task, we sent 4 and 8 Romanian mountain brigades, of which the former was around Simferopol and the latter engaged in guarding the eastern coast of the Crimea, to Feodosia to deal with any attempt the enemy might make to land at this critical spot. Simultaneously, orders were given to the only regimental group of 73 Division still in the Crimea, i.e. the reinforced 213 Infantry Regiment, to move on Feodosia from Jenichek. By 28th December, 46 Infantry Regiment actually succeeded in eliminating both the enemy beachheads north and south of Kerch, except for a small body of troops still fighting on the northern shore. In spite of this, Count Sponek again asked permission to evacuate the Kerch Peninsula. This we categorically forbade, still being convinced that any surrender of the Kerch Peninsula might well lead to a situation which the army would be unable to master with the forces at its disposal. Meanwhile, on 28th December, 54 Corps had moved off for its last attack on Sevastopol. Yet the enemy was on the point of delivering a new blow. Early on 29th December, we heard that he had carried out a night landing at Feodosia under cover of strong naval forces. Our own weak forces there, one engineer battalion, anti-tank troops and some coastal batteries, the Romanians not having started to arrive until the following morning, had been unable to stop the landing. Our telephone link with 42 Corps headquarters, which was located somewhere in the middle of the peninsula, was out of action, but at 1000 hours we were notified by radio that Count Sponek had ordered the immediate evacuation of the peninsula because of the new landings at Feodosia. Though we immediately issued a countermand, it was never picked up by 42 Corps signals. While fully appreciating the Corps' anxiety not to be cut off by the enemy at Feodosia, we still did not believe that the situation would in any way be improved by a headlong withdrawal. Simultaneously with countermanding the evacuation of the Kerch Peninsula, 11th Army ordered the Romanian Mountain Corps to throw the enemy forces disembarked at Feodosia straight back into the sea with the help of the 2 brigades mentioned earlier and a Romanian motorized regiment now in the process of moving up. Although we had no illusions about the offensive capacity of these Romanian formations, the enemy could still not be present at Feodosia in any real strength, and if we struck with real determination, it should be possible to catch him at a disadvantage. At the worst, we felt, the Romanians would manage to contain the enemy in a narrow beachhead around Feodosia until German troops could get there. Development of the situation on the Kerch Peninsula. Even this hope was to prove illusory, however. Far from carrying home its attack on Feodosia, the Romanian Mountain Corps actually allowed a handful of Soviet tanks to push it right back to a point east of Stary Krim. By a series of forced marches, 46th Infantry Division did in fact reach the narrow stretch of land at Parpash. In doing so, however, it had to abandon most of its guns on the ice-covered roads, and its troops arrived in a state of complete exhaustion. From the small beachhead still in his hands north of Kerch, the enemy was immediately able to take up the pursuit, the speed with which his reinforcements arrived being due to the freezing over of the straits. Had the Soviet commander pressed home his advantage properly by pursuing 46th Division really hard from Kerch and thrusting relentlessly after the Romanians as they fell back from Feodosia, the fate of the entire 11th Army would have been at stake. As it happened, he did not know when to take time by the forelock. Either he did not realize what a chance he had, or else he did not venture to seize it. And so it was possible, with the help of an exhausted 46th Division, 213 Infantry Regiment, which had meanwhile arrived from Genicek, and the Romanians, to build up a protective front, albeit a perilously thin one, between the northern slopes of the Yaila Mountains near Stary Krim and the Zivash west of Akhmonai. In order to stiffen the Romanian troops and safeguard their heavy weapons, all available German officers and men, including those who could be spared from 11th Army headquarters, were attached to Romanian units. By 15th January 30 and 42, Corps were ready to counterattack on the Feodosia front. The decision to risk this attack was a hard one, for it had to be launched with 3.5 weakened German divisions and a Romanian mountain brigade against an opponent whose strength had meanwhile increased to 8 divisions and 1 brigade. The enemy, moreover, had a limited number of tanks at his disposal, whereas we had none at all. The support of the Luftwaffe was more than doubtful, since bad weather had prevented it from flying any sorties against Feodosia for the last few days. Nevertheless, we had to take the chance and attack. Thanks to the bravery of the troops, the attack succeeded, and by 18th of January, Feodosia was ours. In addition to 6,700 dead, the enemy had lost 10,000 prisoners, 177 guns, and 85 tanks. It now emerged that the Luftwaffe had still done a good job in Feodosia harbour, in spite of the bad flying conditions, and had sunk a number of transport vessels. Our success at Feodosia naturally led us to consider the possibility of immediately exploiting it to get the Soviet armies right out of the Kerch Peninsula. But desirable though this would have been, 11th Army decided, after careful reflection, that it could not be done with the resources available, especially now that a tank battalion and 2 bomber wings originally promised to us, the very forces we should have needed for the task in question, had to go to the Army Group. 11th Army thus had to dispense with any sweeping exploitation of its achievements at Feodosia and to content itself with throwing the enemy back as far as the Parpach bottleneck, where the Kerch Peninsula could be sealed off between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. There was certainly nothing pusillanimous about this decision. We simply realized that after everything the troops had gone through to date, it might cause very serious reverses to demand too much of them now. Even though the recapture of Feodosia and the sealing off of the Kerch Peninsula at Parpach had temporarily banished a mortal danger, we did not let that lull us into a false sense of security. At that particular time, the enemy was striving everywhere on the Eastern Front to make good his defeats of the previous summer and to regain the initiative. Why should he make an exception of the Crimea, where his mastery of the sea offered him such exceptionally good prospects? Success here could have decisive repercussions on the entire situation in the East, politically with regard to Turkey and economically through the recovery of a base for air operations against the Romanian oil fields. Another point to consider was that Soviet propaganda had linked the offensive against the Crimea so closely with the name of Stalin that it was most unlikely to be called off. And sure enough, we soon discovered that the enemy was pushing reinforcements across to Kerch. Having possession of the frozen straits, he could put up with the loss of the port of Feodosia. Air photography continually showed the enemy to be concentrated in strength in his Black Sea harbours and the airfields in the area north of the Caucasus, and as early as 29th January, intelligence estimates of his strength on the Parpach front amounted to more than 9 divisions, 2 rifle brigade groups, and 2 independent tank brigades. The Sevastopol front was also livening up again, particularly where the artillery was concerned. After weeks of outward calm that were really loaded with tension, the enemy finally launched his big offensive on 27th of February. The heavy battles that followed on both the Parpach and Sevastopol fronts continued with unremitting violence until 3rd March. Then on both sides a period of exhaustion ensued. On the Parpach front, we had eventually succeeded in containing the enemy breakthrough in the northern sector by making effective use of the marshlands there.